I am a writer and a teacher of creative writing. In both pursuits, one central theme has been my identity as a Sansei, a third-generation Japanese American. For my own story, the story of my family and my community, and indeed the history of America, is intricately bound up with the question of identity. Who am I? Who are we? In his memoir on American film, The Devil Finds Work, James Baldwin writes this about identity. The question of identity is a question involving the most profound panic, a terror as primary as the nightmare of the mortal fall. When identity is questioned only when it is menaced, as when the mighty begin to fall, or when the wretched begin to rise, or when the stranger enters the gates, never thereafter to be a stranger, the stranger's presence making you the stranger, less to the stranger than to yourself. Identity would seem to be the garment with which one covers the nakedness of the self. To question one's identity, Baldwin observes, can induce a terror that rivals reckoning with our mortality. In other words, it's as scary as death. And yet the story of America from its beginnings has involved questions and changes in our identity, particularly in our racial identities. We've seen this past year. I live in Minneapolis, just a few miles from where Philando Castile was killed by a police officer, and a couple miles from where George Floyd was killed by 4 police, and where local protests sparked protests across the nation, and indeed the world. As a result, an unprecedented portion of the white population seemed to awaken to what Black and brown people have been saying for years about police brutality and racism in the justice system. Out of tragedy and injustice bloomed a profound hope and call for change. And yet, at the same time, an increasing portion of the white population has not just criticized these protests, but has doubled down on celebrating racism. There's been an alarming rise of racial microaggressions in white hate groups. We seem to be moving forwards and backwards at the same time. As many know, sometime after 2040, America will no longer be a white majority country. Every racial group will be a minority. There are some white Americans who fear this change, who feel their power, their might, to use Baldwin's term, is waning. Many believe whites have always defined what America is. And no matter what our demographics or elections indicate, whites alone should define America. And yet, America has never been a pure white nation. Instead, it has always been a country where strangers are encountering strangers. And from our beginnings, these encounters have engendered questions of identity from both whites and people of color. From the first encounters with indigenous people to the institution of slavery, from the taking of native lands to the Civil War, to desegregation and the civil rights movement. White identity is always presumed and often exploited those who were not white. Now, we Japanese Americans know what it's like to be the unwelcome stranger, the one who walks into a village eyed with suspicion and fear. Decades of anti-Asian and yellow peril sentiment set the groundwork for the imprisonment of 120,000 of the Japanese community during World War II. My parents, 11 and 15, and natural-born citizens, were taken from their homes without a trial, imprisoned in concentration camps along with their families in desolate areas of Idaho and Arkansas, behind barbed wire fences and rifle towers with guards. In 1942, here's what Tennessee Senator Tim Stewart said on the floors of Congress. They are cowardly and immoral. They are different from Americans in every conceivable way, and no Japanese should ever have the right to claim American citizenship. A Jap is a Jap, anywhere you find him. And his taking the oath of allegiance to this country would not help, even if he should be permitted to do so. They do not believe in God and have no respect for an oath. And yet, despite such racism, and even while their families were imprisoned, my uncles served in the famed Japanese-American 442nd Regiment, the most decorated unit in the European theater. Generals competed to bring the 442nd under their command because the 442nd fought so fiercely and captured targets other troops could not, including rescuing the famed Texas Lost Battalion trapped behind Nazi lines. Those Texans were at first surprised to see Japanese faces coming up the hill to rescue them, wandering, as it were, into their village. That encounter changed not just those Texans' understanding of Japanese Americans, but of themselves. And afterwards, those Texans sang the praises of the Buddha heads, which is what members of the 442nd called themselves. A lesser-known fact is that Japanese-American military linguists studied at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, to help in combat in the Pacific Theater, in intelligence, in interrogations, on the battlefield, and in code breaking. Armed Forces commanders estimated these Japanese-American military linguists helped shorten the war in the Pacific by 2 years. And saved hundreds of thousands, even millions of American lives. The very cultural background which made them suspicious to so many white Americans became a vital asset to this country, as were the linguistic skills of the Navajo code talkers, made famous in the movie Wind Talkers. Diversity is America's strength, our hope. Our diversity fuels our creativity in the arts, in business, in government, in all aspects of our society. Now, it took America over 40 years to recognize the injustice of the Japanese-American internment. But in 1988, the U.S. Congress and President Ronald Reagan issued an apology to our community. This apology acknowledged that there was no military necessity for the internment. Instead, the real reasons for our imprisonment were racism, wartime hysteria, and the failure of leadership. At this apology, many Japanese Americans, including me, thought, finally, America has recognized this injustice. It will never happen again. Unfortunately, we were wrong. In the years since the first Gulf War, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-immigrant sentiment has risen in this country. The Japanese-American internment has been cited not as an egregious wrong recognized by Congress and President Reagan, but as precedent, as justification for the anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant measures. In the Twin Cities where I live, we have the largest Muslim Somali-American population in the country. My children, particularly my middle son Nico, have had many Somali-American friends. At the same time, my children have witnessed anti-Muslim sentiment directed towards these friends in the Somali community. A few years ago, one of my son Nico's Somali friends, Abdi, was shot and killed outside a recreation center, most likely a mistaken casualty of gang conflicts. I'm ending my talk with my poem about Abdi's and my son's friendship, a conjunction of two histories, Japanese Americans and Somali Americans. It is an answer to our fears of the stranger who walks into our village. It explores how we question and change our identities, take off our old robes, don new ones, and thus admit our nakedness and limitations, our mortality, but also our ability to hope, to love, and to grow. Poem for Abdi. 10:35. Gnats, mosquitoes, blurring streetlights in the parking lot of the Coil Rec Center. And Abdi smoking, chilling just after the lights slipped away on this near solstice. And the lines he's on fleek flow through that girl he passed at the Mall of America, the apartment he'll go back to without his mother, return to Mogadishu to aid his dying poet father, heart failing without metaphor. And Abdi thinks, tomorrow I'll be breaking Ramadan. As the beats my son Nico laid down for him start to jump. My brain ain't neurological, beyond ecological. I've torched the devil's follicles, stroking his blood-red tail, thinking where we failed and where a bullet sails, lurking late for Ismail. 3 shots, pop, pop, pop. Here's only the first shot behind him, in his head, his lines, that girl Ismail, his mother, the fast off Ramadan all explode from his skull into the June night as he topples. And suddenly there's 2 black brothers over him, smashing at his chest, and he's not even thinking, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And the streetlight above burns fluorescence into his retina, gnats, mosquitoes, a strange yellow glow just before the red, the red, the red, the red. And he'll never witness his brother, his sister Jamila, his friends Baden and Khadijah, and my son Nico, hunkered in the waiting room as the surgeons huddle 2 hours to undo what can't be undone. And 3 days later, Nico stands with Abdi's friends and family, his mother just returned from Somalia, his father still dying, unable to fly. And there is no coffin to cover his sleeping face, as he's lowered 2 graves from Baden's brother. And my son grips his shaking girlfriend, and as he looks at Abdi's mother, the only Somali mother he says whoever accepted him even loved him, he thinks of the track he and Abdi jammed on, the album they'd planned, and how just hours earlier at work, when he told his boss what had happened, his boss shot back, well, that's what you get for hanging around with those people. And how did they get to be my son's people? And how am I to comfort my son, weeping before me now in my study? Or chastise him for using my wife's credit card to help buy the mother's plane fare and a bus ticket for another friend to leave for Fargo so he doesn't become one more Abdi. And my son is saying, he looked at Abdi's mother's face falling into her son in the grave. They wanted to rip the clouds from the sky, rip his boss's hairs from their follicles, cut the tracks of their album that will never be finished, and the kids in school shouting at Abdi, look at me, I'm the captain, and hey, Mohammed suicide bomber. And my son saying, I can't believe he's dead. I can't take it in, Dad. And I'm holding him as Abdi will never be held by his mother. His father, the poet, dying in Mogadishu. And I can't say I hate this world as much as you, Nico, though that too is in my heart. And so I say, Abdi's life was not his death. Your friendship was not his death. His music was not his death. And so I say, listen, He's still rapping. Those lines are still there. He's still talking to you. What is he saying? And Nico, as his body shakes in my arms, he'd want me. He'd want me to be happy. And I see Abdi's face standing beside us. And I say, thank you, Abdi. Thank you for loving my boy. Thank you.